Okay, we're going to begin a study today over the Pentateuch. I can tell you when we're going to start. I cannot tell you when we'll end. It'll be a minute. So I can tell you how long this will take us. This is something that I've kind of been looking forward to for a couple of years and just trying to track. And I try for us to stay in the Old Testament, New Testament, Old Testament, New Testament. So we did Acts last year for the 13th time. So it's time for us to move to the New Testament. And so there are 9 things that I kind of want us to help us in framing our study beginning over the next few weeks. And so I'll try to go through these quickly for us this morning. The Pentateuch is the first main section in the Bible. It's the first main kind of grouping of books that kind of set the stage for the rest of the Bible. So there are 5 books in the Pentateuch, right? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. You have these 5 books that make up the Pentateuch. So Genesis answers, just big stroke here, 2 big questions. How did God's relationship with the world begin? It's creation, the creation of man. And where did the nation of Israel come from? Which begins with Abraham. So you have these 2 main kind of questions that Genesis answers. Exodus, God saves Israel from slavery in Egypt and then enters into a special relationship with them. So you have Moses leading the nation of Israel out of bondage and captivity in the nation of Israel, which came as a result of Joseph and his family moving. You remember all that? It's kind of interesting how it all ties together. In Leviticus, God gives Israel instructions for how to worship him. So you get to the book of Leviticus in your yearly reading. Right now, I don't know where you are. I'm in Job. But you get to the Leviticus in your yearly reading, and you're like, holy cow. Now, you read it, and you're bored out of your mind. But think about having to read it and then live by it and be taught it every single day, right? So you have Leviticus, and God's saying, here are the things that you have to do in order to worship me. So begins the relationship with them in Genesis, leads them out of slavery in Exodus, tells them this is how you're to worship me in Leviticus. In Numbers, remember, Israel fails to trust and obey God and wanders in the wilderness for 40 years, right? You have the event at Kadesh Barnea where they're like, let's go. And the groups are like, no, we're not going to. And so God says, fine, just wander around the desert in 40 years. And then in Deuteronomy, Moses gives Israel instructions. And really, in some ways, it's a recap of Exodus and Numbers for how to love and obey God in the promised land. So it's kind of the end mark. So Moses is with us in Exodus, and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. But really, it's interesting about Deuteronomy. I'm going to go quick, but Deuteronomy is really Moses sitting down with the children of the parents who decided not to obey and wandered around in the desert and died. So it's like Moses saying, like bringing in Carter Summer and Tillion's story and saying, listen, your daddy didn't obey and he didn't make it. But I'm telling you, this is how you are to do it when you head to the promised land, which happens in the book of Joshua. So that's kind of the beginning part of the book in big strokes. Second, the Pentateuch is referred to as the book of Moses. In fact, what's interesting, and I'll show you some verses here, it's really viewed historically as one book, right? We've divided it into Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But it's not referred to the books of Moses, it's just the book of Moses, right? All 5 books together. Here's some verses. Micah 12:26. As for the dead being raised, haven't you read the book of Moses? Not the books, the book of Moses. And the passage about the burning bush, how God said to him, I'm the God of Abraham, the God of Jacob and Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Here's another one. Ezra 6:18. They all appointed the priests by their divisions and the Levites by the groups to the services of God in Jerusalem, according to what is written in the book of Moses, which is what probably goes back to how he divided it up with his father-in-law Jethro, right? Third, Nehemiah 13:1. At that time, the book of Moses, one book, was read publicly to the people. So imagine you have the Genesis, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then you read them publicly. The command was written in it that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. That's in Nehemiah. 2 Chronicles 25:4. However, he did not put their children to the death because it's written in the law, the book of Moses, where the Lord commanded, fathers are not to die because of children, and children are not to die because of their fathers, but each one will die for his own sin. Here's another one, 2 Chronicles 25:22. They removed the burnt offerings so that they might be given to the groupings of the ancestral families of the law people to offer to the Lord, according to what is written in the book of Moses. They did the same with the cattle. Luke 16:31. But he told them, If they don't listen to Moses and the prophets, they will not be persuaded if someone rises from the dead, referring back to Moses. Luke 24. Remember, this is Jesus, right? He's on the road to Emmaus. He's sitting down with guys, beginning with Moses and all the prophets. So going back to the beginning of it, he interpreted all for them the things concerning himself in all the scriptures. I was listening to a guy give a lecture on this, and he was arguing that it wasn't Moses who put Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy together, because there are sections in it where obviously it's not Moses writing, right? Because it says Moses died, right? So it's kind of hard to write Moses died if Moses is dead, right? And so his argument was that during Kings and Chronicles, kind of that time period, that all of these Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy are just a bunch of stories that were kind of passed down, and all a group of people got together and assembled them together. So it's not really Moses writing, it's just kind of a collection of stories. Okay, here's the creation story, here's the story of Joseph, here's the story of Kadesh Barnea, here's the story of Deuteronomy chapter 6. And so during that time frame, people got together and put the books together. I don't know where your view is. I think Moses wrote it because that's what the Bible said. So, number 3, Deuteronomy 34:10. No prophet has risen again in Israel like Moses. So this, it's like, what's the significance of Moses? Well, you remember this in Deuteronomy. No prophet has risen again in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unparalleled for all the signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do against the land of Egypt, to Pharaoh, to his officials, and to all his land. And for all the mighty deeds, acts of power, and terrifying deeds that Moses performed in the sight of all of Israel. I mean, Moses was the leader for a main section of the Pentateuch. So here's number 3. The Pentateuch begins to teach about redemption, which is why this book is often referred to as the book of redemption. You have the book of Moses kind of referred to as the book of redemption, but it begins to teach the story of this, right? When does this happen? Well, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, right after the fall of man, remember God says to them, I'll put hostility between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He'll strike your head, and you'll strike his heel, which is a foreshadowing of Christ and what Christ would do, right? So it said this picture of redemption, and you have this, we'll talk about this in just a minute, but you have Israel being redeemed out of slavery from the Egyptians. You have is it Exodus chapter 12, where you put the blood on the post. You have this picture of redemption. It's kind of begin to place into the minds of people, which will ultimately will be fulfilled to in Christ. Number 4, the Pentateuch demonstrates creation as the arena of redemption. So Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2 and 3, you have the creation of creation, you have the creation of man, but this is the arena, the theater, if you will, of where creation takes place, or redemption takes place in the Redeemer creation. Number 5, the Pentateuch introduces the first covenants that Yahweh made with his people. So there's generally speaking, there's 6 covenants. 4 of them are in the Pentateuch, 2 of them are not. What are the 2 that are not in the Pentateuch? David's covenant and Jeremiah, right? The covenant that Jesus was referred to in Jeremiah, right? So you have 4 covenants that are referred to in the covenant, in the Pentateuch. What are they? What's the first one? Nope. What's the first one? No. In between Adam and Abraham. Noah, there you go. All right, very good. All right, you all get there. You have the creation covenant, Genesis chapter 1, 26 through 30, and Genesis chapter 2, 15 through 25. You have this creation covenant that God makes with Noah there, right? Genesis chapter 1, 26. Then God said, let us make man in our image according to our likeness. They will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth. So God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and every creature that crawls on the earth. And God said, look, I've given you every seed-bearing plant on the surface of the entire earth, and every tree whose fruit contains seed. This will be food for you. For all the wildlife of the earth, for every bird of the sky, every creature that crawls on the earth, everything having the breath of life in it, I've given also every green plant for them, and it was so. And then you have, the creation covenant was first. Then you have the Noah covenant. I know I saw people correcting me. Good, you need to correct me. The second one is the covenant with Noah, right? And you have the covenant that God makes with Noah. Then God said to Noah and his sons with him, Genesis chapter 9, verse 8, understand that I'm establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you. When you read this, I read this a couple of days ago in our yearly reading. Underline every time the word covenant is mentioned in this section here. There's covenant, there's one time, verse 10. And with every living creature that's with you, birds, livestock, and all the wildlife of the earth that are with you, all the animals of the earth that came out of the ark, I will establish my covenant with you that never again will every creature be wiped off the floodwaters. There will never again be a flood to destroy them. And God said, this is a sign of the covenant I'm making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all future generations. I've placed my bow in the clouds, and it will be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. Whenever I form clouds over the earth and the bow appears in the clouds, I will remind my covenant between me and you and the living creatures. Water will never again become a flood to destroy every creature. The bow will be in the clouds, and I'll look at it and remember the permanent covenant between God and man and the living creatures on earth. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant that I've established between me and every creature on earth. So you have the Noah covenant, right? Not going to flood the earth again. Then you have the covenant with Abraham. And I'm not going to read all this, but Yahweh makes with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, Genesis chapter 11, mentioning in Genesis chapter 15, mentioning in Genesis chapter, here's Genesis chapter 12, where God makes the covenant with Abraham. Then the Lord said to Abraham, you go out from your land and your relatives and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I'll make you into a great nation. I'll bless you. I'll make your name great. You will be a blessing. I'll bless those who bless you and curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So you have the Abraham covenant. And then you have the covenant that God makes with Moses and Israel in Exodus chapter 19 through 24. I will not read that. You can read that. So there's 4 covenants. So the Pentateuch has the 4 covenants in it. Number 6, the Pentateuch records the greatest act of redemption in the entire Old Testament, which is what? Say again? Yeah. When the nation of Israel comes out of Egypt, Moses leads them out, right? The writer of Hebrews talks about Christ being the greater Moses, right? You just kind of, this picture of this is what Abraham did, and so you have the picture of that. We'll get to that sometime in July. In order to understand the Bible's message, we need to understand Israel's exodus from Egyptian slavery. So in order to understand really the entire Bible, you have to understand the exodus of Israel from their slavery there. Number 7, 3 more. The Pentateuch taught Israel how to live as the redeemed people of Yahweh. So I think this is interesting. We'll get to this. You have Israel coming out of slavery in Exodus, and then you have God sitting down with Israel and saying, because I've redeemed you, this is how you are to live. This is how you're to act. This is how you're to behave, right? In fact, you'll remember in Exodus, he says these words. The beginning of the 10 Commandments. God spoke these words and said, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. In fact, when you read through the Bible this year, underline how many times God says this phrase. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of slavery. He says this a ton, and this constant reminder of, I'm the one who redeemed you. I'm the one who brought you out of slavery. It was me. It wasn't Moses. It wasn't some crazy. It was me. I brought you out, and now this is how you're supposed to live. This is how you're supposed to act as a redeemed person that I've redeemed from there. Number 8, in order to understand the rest of the Old Testament, you have to understand the Pentateuch. So in order to understand Kings and Chronicles and Ezra and Nehemiah, you have to understand the Pentateuch, which is so important. Number 9, the last one, the Pentateuch points us to Christ and the gospel. It is this pointing of Christ the Lamb, our need for redemption, not out of slavery from Egypt, but out of slavery from our sin, and this kind of this picture of pointing us to the gospel of the Lord Jesus Christ. I'll end with this. What's the next book after the Pentateuch? Joshua, right? Okay. One of my favorite passages out of Joshua is Joshua chapter 1. When God looks at Joshua and says these words, Moses, my servant, is dead. Like, that's the end of it. Moses is dead. You're now in charge. And you're now going to take the nation of Israel to the promised land that I wanted Moses to lead them to. He wasn't able to do it. He got angry. He hit the rock, and he's not able to make it. Aaron's not able to make it. Now you're in charge. Moses is dead. You're in charge. You're heading towards the promised land. But do you remember what he said to Joshua in the significance of this moment? He says these words. He says, this book of instruction, these books shall not depart from your mouth. You're to meditate on it day and night so that you may carefully observe everything written in it. He didn't have Ephesians. He didn't have Colossians. He didn't have Nehemiah. He didn't have Ezra. He had nothing. This writing, Moses' book, these instructions, these things I'm giving to you. For if you observe them and follow them, then you will be prosper and you will succeed in everything you do. There is a heavy significance in scriptures on the book of Moses, the Pentateuch, these 5 books. And I just was struck by this as I thought, of all the things that God could have said to Moses, Joshua, he says, Moses is dead. But here's what you're going to do. You're going to the promised land. And on your way there, you need to take this book and you need to meditate on it. You need to think about it. And it will allow you to prosper. You'll honor me and you'll succeed in whatever you do. So we're going to embark on a journey next week through the Pentateuch. We will not take verses at a time. We'll probably take chapters and chunks at a time. You need to bring your fast listening ears because we're going to read fast. But it'll be my prayer. I was praying about this. I want this to be an opportunity for 2 things. One, my prayer is that we learn something that we've never learned that's embedded in the truths of the Pentateuch. You guys have heard these stories from felt boards, probably before felt boards, right? You have heard these stories since you were knee-high to the railing of a nursery cradle. But I don't want this to be, I've heard this story before. I've listened to this. I've been taught this. I know this. I've taught that Bible study. I've listened to that sermon. I preached that sermon. I want this to be refreshed. I want this to be something new in our hearts, that God would awaken us to it. And then I pray that God would use this to convict us, right? Not just for us to learn something, but convict us in our own hearts, in our lives, in our walk with the Lord.